Hey everyone, out on a walk again today and thinking about a really nuanced and interesting area of UI development that rarely has a right answer, but I'm just going to chew on it today. And if you have any thoughts as well that you want to share about this, please feel free to reach out to me. It's just such an interesting space that I see coming up again and again, and I'm just trying to harden my thoughts around it all. And the topic is, how do we give more information about entities in our system in a way that feels right and feels good and feels powerful for users? So what do I mean? Let's ground it in a specific experience, and that is a task list. So we have a list and it has tasks in it. They might be, say, take out the garbage, go for a walk, record your podcast, and each of those are tasks. Then those tasks themselves can have additional information. So it might have a description in there, you might have a due date, you might have some tags, you might have a conversation. There's more information about that task. How do we show this to users in a helpful way? What are the options we have? I guess the first option is you display it inline. So you might have, your tasks are actually expandable items, and you click on it and it expands and it shows all of the information about that entity. That's helpful because you're kind of maintaining the relationships. It's very clear, okay, this particular section belongs to this item. But the downside is that can get really messy really quickly. And especially if you wanted to, say, have this nice view of how the tasks work, as soon as you have expandables in there, the layout can get really kind of funky pretty quickly. For very basic things, expandables can be helpful, but I found as soon as you have any meaningful complexity in there or some extra information that's not just very trivial, expands kind of fall apart. So what options do you have after that? Okay, well, one that's very tried and true is you click on an item and it opens in it's a page navigation and you have a detail view. And that's fine, right? You have this view, it's the details of this entity. You can update what you need to, you press done, and potentially it navigates back. The downside of that particular experience is that you've lost all the context around that task, that entity, and how it related to other things. And so that loss of context can be kind of harmful in building the experience. A full page navigation as well often feels quite heavy. Like, let's say you're just clicking on a task, you wanted to see some more information. You've now gone to another page. Okay, I saw that information, now I go back. You might have had some scroll position, you might have had some active edits on the page. They're potentially lost because you've done these kind of full navigations. So it can be a pretty heavy interaction to introduce a whole new page for a detail view. Now, often it's appropriate and good and fine to do that, but it can feel a little heavy. So then the next step, I think, from a full page view is to have a modal, where in the modal you show this is a layer that pops up on top of the interface with some sort of border around it, so you can still see that you're still on the underlying page, but you're sort of drilled in a little bit more. And this modal can show all that extra information about this entity. You kind of get the benefit of a full transition, full page, full another view, except it's very easy for the user to get right back to where they were before. They can just sort of click outside the modal or press escape and they're just back, right? So I think that modal view generally is a bit of a step up on the whole new page experience for drilling into entities. However, the modal still does suffer from the same problem that the full page view did, and that is that you've lost context about the relationships between entities in your system. Like, let's say you had a task list and you had a few tasks there. You open the the detail view, you often can't see the other entities on that page. And so I know I've done this, you go in, you look at this entity, you start updating it, you close it, only to realize there was something else right next to it that was actually very similar, and now they're kind of clashing in their scope. And I do that, all the time. And so that is a problem, I think, with modals, is that you do lose some of that, and full pages, is that you lose some of the important information about how that entity, how that task, for example, related to other tasks in the list. So then we have this other option, which is also quite common, and that is where you'll have a side panel. So this is not the sidebar where you have your navigation. It's a totally separate panel that often you'll say click on an entity, and the detail view of that entity will open to the side of the page. And so you'll have your main experience, which will have your lists or, all that information in context. And then you'll have your drill down view on a left to right interface. Usually it's on the right-hand side, a panel that kind of appears there. And it'll have, you can sort of think of it as having the same information as that full page experience or a modal, but it's just off to the side. That's pretty cool because you get kind of the best of both worlds. You can see all the context in the main section, and then you can see the detail view in the panel that's opened up. However, it might be surprising to you to learn that I'm building a new app and I'm not reaching for a side panel yet. And why am I not doing that? And the answer is that side panels by themselves don't translate very well across form factors. On a desktop experience, having a side panel is great. You've got that extra horizontal real estate. You can make use of it. You've got the main view, detail view next to it. You get all the benefits of all of it. But that won't work on a mobile. Like, you can't have that side panel be there and the main panel at the same time. It'll just be too squished and you won't see anything. So there's just some more problems you have to solve with the side panel. So, there are answers. So things like, hey, on mobile, the side panel will effectively become a modal. So there's a few ways you could do that, but effectively between the transition, between the viewport sizes, you either render a sidebar or you render a modal, or some hybrid where all of a sudden your side panel now sits on top of the other content on the page, effectively a modal, but maybe not centered, maybe kind of on this, bleeding across from the right side edge for a right-hand panel, kind of over the content to make it clear that's a side panel. And that's fine, but it also, I think, introduces a potential hidden foot gun. And that is that when you're building out a panel experience, often you're building the panel in such a way that it's leveraging context from the main content. There's just some things you probably don't want to or need to explain from a panel view when you know the main content is there. You don't have to repeat yourself. In fact, it can look kind of weird to be repeating yourself in the panel. But when the panel is full screen, that comes back to bite you because that panel often doesn't have all of the context that you would have wanted if it was a full page experience, if it was a modal, because it was leveraging the context from the main area. And so that's a really interesting thing to get right. You sort of need to then look at the panel and go, okay, is it helpful when it's a full page experience, like on a desktop? And also, does it have enough context if it's on a smaller viewport, and this is the only thing that's visible, for people to actually get what they need to done? And so you kind of need to be thinking about it in two separate ways. And when it's done well, it's great. It's pretty cool. But there's also that technical complexity, and okay, now you have to watch the viewport and potentially change, or at least change the styling, but you might be completely changing it to use a modal versus a side panel. And there's complexity in doing that translation. It's not necessarily just a few lines of CSS. Sometimes it can be some pretty heavy JavaScript, which isn't great. So it's just getting that problem kind of working well, both the UX and the technical, is interesting to work through. On the other hand, if you're just using a modal, it's the same path for everyone always. So on desktop, it's a modal. On mobile, on smaller viewports, it's a modal. And then when you're thinking about it as a modal experience, it always has to have enough context for the user to be able to achieve the outcomes that the modal was designed to do without relying on the content that was on the page behind it. And so you're already thinking about that problem for every experience, for the desktop experience as well as for smaller viewports. Like, it's the same thing. You have to think, okay, what context do they need to get something meaningful done here? And once you nail that, you've nailed it for all of the viewports. So circle back, I think that a detailed view on the side panel, which shows just enough context that's needed on desktop and then potentially translates to a modal or a modal-like experience on smaller viewports, and potentially adds in whatever missing context it needed on mobile, is potentially like the best of both worlds. Doing that well is really hard and requires ongoing diligence to make sure that user experience is great. And the benefit of that too is that, on that bigger desktop view, they can get all the context. It's so easy to communicate. It feels really great, but it's tricky to get that kind of working consistently well over time. Whereas if you just start with modals, it's actually a really simple pattern that you can use, and it's going to work across all viewports really well from the beginning. So that's just one of those tricky things where I've actually landed on, okay, I'm going to use a modal because I know that I'm designing it well. And if I design this modal well, it's got enough context in it so everyone knows what's happening. Yes, it doesn't potentially have as much context as a side panel, but I know it's going to work. I'm solving that context problem really well on desktop, and I'm going to get the benefit of that on smaller viewports as well. If you start with a modal, you kind of have to get it working well for desktop, and by doing that, you're also, almost by design, getting it working well for smaller viewports as well. And so I love that idea that, especially when you're starting out, like, don't overcomplicate your life. So it feels like, especially at the stage of the apps that I'm working on in my own time, I can sidestep the whole complexity around translating side panels to modals and also the user experience stuff, and just start with a modal. It works well on desktop. Maybe it's suboptimal on desktop, but it's fine if you it's generally fine if you design it well. And so I think that's sort of a nice outcome to land on, which all circles around this idea that there's often not one right answer to these problems. It's all trade-offs. And so, yes, a side panel can be really helpful depending on the app and stage of the app. There's other problems to solve, but it can be a very high watermark. Whereas modals often is a more pragmatic choice to get something working well across lots of viewport sizes. Maybe it's not the same high watermark, but the complexity and cost is considerably lower. And so at least for the little app that I'm building, I'm starting with modals, but I can definitely see why people would reach for side panels. Yeah, so for the little app I'm building, I'm using modals for my detail views. I know it's going to work well across all the viewports out of the box, but I can see why people would reach for side panels, because if done well, I think be an overall better user experience. I was just having a walk around, chewing on what I was just saying, and another thought that came to me was that side panels actually also introduce more UI onto the page, which can be great, right? You have more context, more things going on, you can do more work and have that context there. But it could very easily become quite overwhelming, I think, if not done well, because the UI is just full of all this information. Whereas at least with a modal, you do get the benefit of it's very focused. And you have to, I'm assuming that the experience is designed well, but ideally the information that they need to achieve what they're trying to do is available in that modal. And so you can draw the user's attention onto a smaller surface. That said, that's often cuts both ways, because sometimes to make those smaller choices, you do need to have the wider context, which is where the side panel kind of shines. So it's a very tricky space, I would say. And I don't think there is a golden answer for how to do it. I think it just, as with a lot of things, it depends. But my kind of gut at the moment is that if you're not sure, start with a modal because of its ease of translation across viewports. And if you find that's not working, or it could be better, then jump to a side panel. That's sort of where my thoughts are right now. But keen to hear what others think on this. It's a pretty nuanced area, and yeah, I don't claim to have a definitive insight into it as well. All right, I hope you're doing well. I'll catch you in the next one.